The 1920s looked like a golden age. Jazz filled the streets, industries boomed, and people believed nothing could go wrong. The world had just survived the horrors of World War I, and now it was dancing. America led the way with record profits, rising stock markets, and a culture built on confidence. It was a time of parties, bright lights, and unstoppable optimism. People bought cars, radios, and houses like never before. Businesses expanded. Cities grew. And many believed that the good times would last forever. But behind the glittering surface, dangerous cracks were quietly spreading. Credit was everywhere. People were borrowing money to buy stocks, homes, and luxuries. Banks were lending recklessly, chasing profit without thinking about risk. Stock prices kept rising, not because companies were always strong, but because everyone believed they would keep going up. It was a house built not on stone, but on dreams and borrowed money. Then, in 1929, everything changed. It began like any normal day, but by sunset, fortunes were destroyed, dreams were crushed, and history shifted. The stock market crashed, wiping out billions of dollars in a matter of hours. Panic spread like wildfire. What started in the towers of Wall Street soon spilled into every street, every shop, every home. Companies collapsed overnight. Jobs disappeared. Banks failed. Ordinary families who once felt secure were suddenly standing in long lines for bread, struggling to survive. But this wasn't just America's nightmare. The shockwaves spread far beyond its borders. Nations around the world, already wounded by the First World War, began to crack under the pressure. Trade slowed. Currencies faltered. Economies fell like dominoes. Europe, still recovering from war, faced new storms. And Germany, already broken and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, fell into even deeper chaos. In this darkness, dangerous voices began to rise. Leaders who promised strength, pride, and revenge found eager ears. People were desperate for hope, even if it came wrapped in hatred and lies. The Great Depression was more than an economic collapse. It was a turning point that reshaped the world. It broke trust in governments, shattered economies, and gave radical movements the power they had been waiting for. This is the story of how financial chaos didn't just ruin lives. It fed the beast that would soon plunge the world into the deadliest war in human history. It looked like the best of times, but behind the smiles, cracks were slowly forming. The 1920s are often called the Roaring Twenties. It was a time when the world, especially the United States, seemed full of hope and excitement. The war was over. Soldiers had returned home. People were ready to move on from the pain of World War I. Cities lit up with new energy. Jazz music filled the air. Radios and cars became part of everyday life. Women started dressing differently, speaking more freely, and stepping into new roles. People danced in clubs, watched silent movies, and celebrated new inventions. Airplanes, refrigerators, telephones, and electric lights gave life a modern glow. The economy was booming. Factories were busy making products that everyone wanted to buy. A new idea, buy now, pay later, became popular. People could purchase cars, radios, and furniture on credit. Banks were lending money easily. Everyone believed the good times would never end. Stock markets became the symbol of quick success. Ordinary people, not just businessmen, started investing. Newspapers talked about how easy it was to get rich through stocks. Many borrowed money to buy even more shares, confident that prices would keep rising. For millions, it felt like the road to endless wealth. But while the world was shining on the outside, small cracks were forming underneath. The boom of the 1920s was built on fragile foundations. Much of the growth was driven by credit. Money people didn't actually have. Companies produced more than they could sell. Farmers grew crops in huge amounts, but prices dropped because there was too much supply. Many rural families, especially farmers, didn't share in the wealth. While cities danced to jazz, many farms were drowning in debt. Another problem was the growing gap between the rich and the poor. A small group of people made huge profits, while millions earned just enough to survive. This meant that even though production was rising, not everyone could afford to keep buying products. Factories depended on people constantly purchasing more, but many couldn't keep up. Banks also played a risky game. They lent out large sums of money, often without enough security. People trusted banks completely, not realizing how unstable some of them were. As more people borrowed to invest in stocks, a dangerous bubble started to grow, a bubble that could burst at any moment. Internationally, the world economy was linked in complicated ways. After World War I, the US became the world's economic center. It lent money to Europe to help countries rebuild. Germany, for example, borrowed American money to pay war reparations to France and Britain, and those nations then used that money to pay their debts to the US. It was like a financial circle, smooth when the money flowed, but extremely fragile if anything went wrong. Meanwhile, governments and business leaders ignored warning signs. They believed the boom would last forever. Politicians celebrated rising stock prices as proof of national strength. Newspapers printed stories of overnight millionaires. Everyone wanted a piece of the golden dream. The cultural mood of the 1920s also added to this illusion. People were tired of war and seriousness. They wanted to live, laugh, and spend. Prosperity became a kind of religion. If you weren't investing in the stock market, people thought you were missing out. If you questioned the system, you were called pessimistic. But history has a way of turning smiles into silence. The shiny surface of the 1920s covered deep weaknesses: too much credit, overproduction, rising inequality, and risky banking. It was like building a house on sand. It looked beautiful, but it couldn't hold against a storm. By the end of the decade, the cracks were no longer small. The stock market was filled with borrowed money. Many families were deeply in debt. Farms were failing. And the world's financial system depended on money continuing to flow in a perfect circle. All it needed was one shock to make everything collapse. No one expected it. No one was ready for it. But that shock was coming, and it would arrive with brutal speed. The world thought the party would last forever. But in 1929, the music stopped. It began like a normal day, but by sunset, fortunes were destroyed, dreams were crushed, and history changed forever. October 29th, 1929, a day now remembered as Black Tuesday. On this single day, the unstoppable rise of the stock market came crashing down. For years, prices had gone up almost non-stop. People believed stocks would never fall. But deep inside the system, pressure was building. And finally, the bubble burst. In the weeks before the crash, small warning signs had started to appear. Some big investors quietly began selling their shares. Stock prices, which had been climbing fast, started to wobble. But most people ignored the signals. They thought, it's just a small dip. Everything will bounce back. Then came the shock. Panic spread through Wall Street like wildfire. People rushed to sell their stocks before prices fell further. But when millions try to sell at the same time, prices don't fall slowly. They collapse. The New York Stock Exchange floor turned into chaos. Traders shouted. Papers flew through the air. Phones rang without stopping. Prices were changing by the second. Fortunes built over years disappeared in minutes. Banks had loaned huge sums to people for buying stocks. When the prices collapsed, borrowers couldn't pay back their loans. Banks faced massive losses. Some completely failed. For ordinary people, it was a nightmare. Imagine putting your life savings into what you thought was a safe bet, only to watch it vanish in a single day. Many had borrowed money to invest. Now they had nothing left, only debts. Newspapers across America printed shocking headlines. People gathered outside banks, desperate to withdraw their money. Long lines formed. Many banks didn't have enough cash to give back. As banks shut their doors, panic grew. People began to lose trust in the entire financial system. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression on its own, but it was the spark that set the fire. The crash destroyed confidence. And when confidence disappears, an economy starts to freeze. Factories reduced production because fewer people were buying. Businesses cut jobs. Unemployment started to rise. And when people lost jobs, they spent even less, creating a vicious cycle. Internationally, the shockwaves were just as powerful. Remember the financial circle between the US, Germany, Britain, and France? That system depended on the constant flow of money. But when American banks collapsed, they stopped lending abroad. Germany couldn't pay reparations. France and Britain struggled to pay their debts. The whole structure began to crumble. In the months after Black Tuesday, more than 5,000 banks in the United States failed. People's savings disappeared overnight. There was no insurance to protect their money. Trust in banks, something that takes years to build, was shattered in weeks. Farmers, already struggling from low crop prices, now faced a complete collapse in demand. Many lost their land. In cities, homeless families built makeshift communities called Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for doing too little, too late. The stock market crash also destroyed a generation's belief in easy success. In the 1920s, getting rich through stocks was seen almost like magic. After the crash, people realized it was built on illusions. Overnight millionaires turned into bankrupt men. Luxurious lives turned into desperate survival. The psychological impact was enormous. People who once dreamed of progress now feared the future. Hope was replaced by uncertainty. Families that had planned to buy homes, send children to school, or open businesses suddenly had nothing left. And it wasn't just America. The world economy was connected. European banks that relied on American money fell. Global trade began to shrink. Factories across continents slowed down. What started as a financial collapse in New York soon became a global economic disaster. In the middle of this chaos, governments struggled to respond. President Hoover believed that the economy would fix itself if people stayed confident. But confidence was already broken. His slow and cautious approach failed to match the scale of the disaster. By 1932, the US economy had shrunk by almost 30%. Unemployment reached record highs. Entire communities were wiped out economically. People went hungry. Bread lines, long lines of people waiting for free food, became a common sight in American cities. The crash of 1929 wasn't just a fall in stock prices. It was the moment the illusion of endless prosperity died. The shiny, fast-paced 1920s ended with a thud, replaced by fear, loss, and desperation. The world had danced through the roaring 20s, but now it had fallen silent. And in that silence, something darker was beginning to grow. Yesterday, they wore suits and dreams. Today, they stand in line for bread. The crash of 1929 was just the beginning. The real pain started when ordinary life began to break down. One by one, jobs disappeared. Banks shut their doors. Families who once felt secure suddenly faced hunger, fear, and hopelessness. In the early 1930s, America changed completely. Just a few years earlier, the country was full of excitement and opportunity. Factories were busy. People were buying cars, radios, and new homes. The mood was optimistic. But after the crash, that confidence collapsed. Factories that had produced goods for a growing market suddenly saw demand fall sharply. People had no money to spend. Shops and companies started closing. Business owners had no choice but to lay off workers. Millions of people who thought their jobs were safe were suddenly unemployed. By 1933, nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of work. That's about 15 million people. Imagine entire neighborhoods where almost no one has a job. Day after day, men and women would wake up and search desperately for work. But most times, they returned home empty-handed. banks made things even worse. During the boom years, many banks had loaned large amounts of money to businesses and investors. When the stock market crashed, those loans could not be repaid. Thousands of banks failed. When a bank failed in those days, people didn't get their money back. There was no insurance. Families lost their life savings overnight. People lined up outside banks, hoping to withdraw their money before the doors shut for good. Many came too late. The trust that people had in the banking system completely disappeared. With no savings, no jobs, and no support, survival became the main focus of daily life. Long lines formed outside soup kitchens, places that gave out free meals to the hungry. These lines were called bread lines, and they became a common sight in cities across America. People who once had stable middle-class lives now stood in line just to get a piece of bread and a bowl of soup. It was humiliating for many, but they had no choice. Hunger doesn't wait for pride. Homelessness grew rapidly. Families who couldn't pay their rent or mortgages were forced out of their homes. Many built small, makeshift communities on the edges of cities. These were called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the crisis. Made from scrap wood, cardboard, and metal, these communities showed just how far the country had fallen. Every day was a fight to survive. Parents skipped meals so their children could eat. People searched through garbage cans for anything useful. Some walked for miles in search of work, only to find hundreds of others standing in line for the same job. The psychological impact was just as painful as the financial one. People who had worked hard all their lives now felt useless and forgotten. A sense of shame spread across the nation. Men who once supported their families struggled to deal with unemployment. Suicides increased. Families broke apart under pressure. Children were not spared either. Many left school to help support their families. Others were sent to live with relatives because their parents could no longer afford to care for them. For millions of kids, childhood became a time of hardship, not joy. Farmers suffered terribly as well. Even before the Depression, crop prices were falling. After the crash, they collapsed even further. Many farmers couldn't pay their debts. Banks took their land. Entire rural communities were left broken. And then came the Dust Bowl, a natural disaster that made everything worse. Years of poor farming practices and drought turned large parts of America's farmland into dry, cracked earth. Giant dust storms destroyed crops, homes, and livelihoods. Thousands of families were forced to leave their farms and travel west in search of work. The American dream that had seemed so real in the 1920s vanished in the 1930s. For most people, the question was no longer, how do we get richer? But how do we make it through another day? The government's response was slow and limited. President Hoover believed that people should help themselves and that the economy would recover on its own. But the scale of the crisis was far bigger than individual effort. As months turned into years, frustration and anger grew. People began to lose faith, not only in banks and businesses, but also in their leaders. This widespread suffering created a deep emotional wound. When a nation goes through years of hunger, fear, and humiliation, it doesn't just affect the economy, it changes people's hearts. It breeds resentment, hopelessness, and a desperate search for someone who promises a way out. And in the middle of this struggle, across the ocean, a wounded Germany was facing an even deeper collapse. The pain of ordinary people was becoming the perfect fuel for dangerous new voices to rise. The crash started in New York, but its echo was heard in every corner of the world. When the American economy fell apart, it wasn't just America that suffered. In the 1920s, the United States had become the economic heart of the world. Money flowed in and out of America like blood in a body. So when the heart stopped beating properly, the entire global system began to weaken. After World War I, many European countries were already struggling. The war had left deep scars, destroyed cities, massive debts, and broken economies. To rebuild, countries like Britain, France, and especially Germany depended heavily on American loans and investments. During the 1920s, US banks lent billions of dollars overseas. Germany used those loans to pay war reparations to Britain and France. Then, Britain and France used that money to pay back their own debts to the United States. It was a delicate financial circle, and America was at the center of it. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and American banks started failing, they pulled their money back from Europe. Loans dried up overnight. The financial circle snapped. Suddenly, Germany couldn't pay reparations anymore. Britain and France couldn't pay their debts. The entire system began to shake. Countries that had relied on exporting goods to the US were hit hard too. As American consumers stopped buying, global demand collapsed. Factories in Europe slowed down. Workers were laid off. The same cycle of falling production, job loss, and shrinking demand that had started in America spread like a wave across the world. Germany, already weak under the weight of the Versailles Treaty, was hit the hardest. Its economy had been held together by American loans. When those disappeared, everything fell apart. Banks collapsed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared. By 1932, around 6 million Germans were jobless. For a country that was still recovering from the humiliation of defeat in World War I, this economic disaster felt like another crushing blow. Other parts of Europe weren't spared either. In Britain, industries like coal, steel, and textiles faced huge declines. Exports fell sharply. Unemployment rose. In France, economic growth slowed dramatically, and political tensions grew. Eastern European countries that depended on exporting raw materials saw their incomes vanish. The crisis spread beyond Europe too. Latin American countries that had depended on exporting goods like coffee, sugar, and minerals to the United States saw their economies collapse. Asia also felt the pain as global trade shrank. It was like a domino effect. Once America fell, one piece after another began to topple. Gold played a big role in making the crisis worse. At that time, many countries were tied to the gold standard, a system where currencies were backed by gold. This system made it difficult for governments to print more money or take bold actions during the crisis. Instead of stimulating their economies, many countries tightened their policies to protect their gold reserves. This made the depression deeper and longer. Trade barriers added more problems. In 1930, the US passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised taxes on imported goods. The goal was to protect American businesses, but other countries responded by raising their own tariffs. Global trade shrank even further. What was supposed to protect the US actually made things worse for everyone. As economies collapsed around the world, political instability grew. In many countries, people lost faith in their governments. Protests, strikes, and riots became common. In some places, extremist movements began to rise, promising strong action and quick solutions. Germany is a key example. The Depression destroyed what little stability the Weimar Republic had. People were desperate for hope and answers. And in this environment, voices that were once considered extreme started to sound convincing. The pain of the economic crisis became the fuel for a dangerous political fire. The global nature of the Depression showed how connected the world had become by the 20th century. A crash in one country could spread across oceans and affect millions of lives far away. But at the time, world leaders didn't fully understand this connection. Many governments acted alone, trying to protect themselves instead of working together to fix the problem. This lack of coordination made the Depression worse and allowed it to last much longer. It also created openings for radical leaders, like Adolf Hitler, to step in and use people's anger for their own goals. By the early 1930s, it was clear. America's problem had become everyone's problem. The wave that started in New York had shaken the world. Economies had collapsed. Political systems were under stress. And in the shadows, dangerous movements were gaining power. The Great Depression wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a global earthquake, and its aftershocks were only beginning. A broken nation, pushed even deeper into the dark. When the Great Depression hit, Germany was already standing on shaky ground. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed its pride, its economy, and its future. Heavy war reparations, lost territories, and military restrictions had left the country struggling throughout the 1920s. But at least back then, American loans had kept Germany afloat. When those loans disappeared after the 1929 crash, the fragile structure collapsed like a house of cards. What followed was not just an economic crisis, it was a total breakdown of society, hope, and stability. Throughout the 1920s, Germany had depended on money borrowed from the United States to rebuild its industries, pay reparations to France and Britain, and keep its economy running. This system was never strong. It was like covering deep wounds with a thin bandage. When American banks pulled their money back, the bandage was ripped away. Banks in Germany began to fail. Businesses lost the capital they needed to operate. Factories shut down. Unemployment, which was already a problem, exploded. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were jobless. That's about 1 in 3 workers. For many German families, daily life turned into a nightmare. People stood in long lines for food. Parents skipped meals so their children could eat. Skilled workers, teachers, war veterans, people who once had stable lives, were now begging on the streets. The economic collapse wasn't just about money. It was about national humiliation. The Versailles Treaty had already made many Germans feel like second-class citizens in their own country. Now, with the Depression, their misery deepened. People felt betrayed by the Allies, by their own government, and by the world. Inflation, which had destroyed savings in the early 1920s, returned in a different form. This time, it wasn't hyperinflation, but deflation. Falling prices that made debts even harder to pay. Businesses couldn't make profits. Farmers couldn't sell their crops. Landlords couldn't collect rents. Everyone was stuck in a downward spiral. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, struggled to respond. Its leaders were divided and weak. Political parties argued instead of acting. Many Germans began to see democracy not as a solution, but as part of the problem. Street violence became common. Different political groups, communists, socialists, nationalists, clashed in the streets. Armed gangs marched through cities, turning politics into open conflict. People no longer trusted the police, the courts, or the politicians. At the same time, international pressure didn't stop. France and Britain still demanded reparations. The German government had less and less money to pay. Each missed payment increased Germany's humiliation on the world stage. For the average German, it felt like there was no way out. The economy was broken. The government was weak. The world was unforgiving. And hunger was real. This deep crisis hit every level of German society. Industrial workers lost their jobs. Middle-class families lost their savings. Farmers lost their land. Soldiers who had fought in World War I felt abandoned. And all of this was happening in a country that had already suffered the pain of defeat and humiliation just a decade earlier. The psychological impact was enormous. A sense of desperation and anger spread like wildfire. People no longer believed in the old ways. They wanted change. Any change. even if it came from dangerous voices. And dangerous voices were waiting. Among them was a man who understood how to use Germany's pain for his own rise, Adolf Hitler. He and his Nazi party had been small players in the 1920s. But now, in the chaos of the Depression, their message of national pride, revenge, and rebirth began to sound powerful. They promised to tear up the Versailles Treaty. They promised jobs, strength, and unity. They promised to make Germany great again. For a nation at rock bottom, these promises felt like light in the darkness. Millions of Germans who had lost faith in democracy turned toward extremism. The Great Depression didn't just make Germany poor, it made Germany desperate. And desperation is dangerous. It created the perfect ground for Hitler's rise. As Germany hit rock bottom, the stage was being set for one of the darkest chapters in human history. The world was about to see what happens when economic despair meets political extremism. But the Weimar Republic didn't have the power, unity, or courage to deal with both at the same time. Parliament, known as the Reichstag, was divided among dozens of political parties. No single party had a clear majority. Every decision required endless debates, compromises, and arguments. Instead of quick solutions, the government delivered slow confusion. Ordinary Germans looked at their leaders and saw weakness. As unemployment rose and hunger spread, the speeches in Parliament began to feel meaningless. People needed bread, jobs, and hope, not political drama. President Paul von Hindenburg, a respected World War I general, held the highest office. But he was old, tired, and not interested in democracy. He preferred strong leaders, not messy debates. When Parliament failed to act, Hindenburg began using emergency powers under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. This article allowed the president to rule by decree in times of crisis, bypassing Parliament entirely. What was supposed to be a temporary measure became a regular habit. Instead of democracy solving problems, it was slowly being pushed aside. Chancellors came and went like actors in a play. Between 1930 and 1933, Germany had 3 different chancellors: Brüning, Papen, and Schleicher. None of them could win the trust of the people or stabilize the country. Their governments were weak, constantly relying on Hindenburg's emergency powers to pass laws. One of these chancellors, Heinrich Brüning, tried to fix the economy by cutting government spending and raising taxes. His idea was to balance the budget and restore foreign confidence. But his policies made the Depression even worse. Cutting spending meant fewer jobs. Raising taxes hurt businesses. Instead of recovery, Germany sank deeper into misery. This failure destroyed people's faith in the government. Germans started to believe that democracy wasn't just weak, it was useless. They began turning away from traditional parties and looking for alternatives. Meanwhile, the Reichstag became a battlefield of ideas. On one side were communists who wanted a revolution like in Russia. On the other were nationalists and fascists who promised strength and national pride. In between were moderate parties struggling to keep control, but they were losing ground fast. Street violence grew worse. Political rallies turned into riots. Paramilitary groups like the Nazi SA, stormtroopers, and the Communist Red Front clashed regularly in cities. Blood was spilled on German streets as political debates turned into open war. The government seemed powerless to stop it. Police forces were stretched thin, courts were overwhelmed, and the military didn't want to get involved in political fights. Every day, the state looked weaker. This growing loss of trust created a dangerous opening. When people no longer believe that their government can protect them, they start looking for someone else who can. Someone strong. Someone who promises order, pride, and simple answers. And in the background, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were watching closely. They didn't need to overthrow the government through violence. The government was collapsing on its own. All they needed was the right moment to step in. By 1932, the Weimar Republic was a democracy in name only. Real power rested with the president and his emergency decrees. Parliament was stuck in endless fights. The economy was in ruins, and the people had lost hope. This was not just a political crisis. It was the slow death of democracy. The fall of the Weimar Republic didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened slowly, through mistrust, weak leadership, and the steady erosion of democratic values. When the storm of the Great Depression hit, the government didn't break overnight. It rotted from the inside. And in that rotting system, a dangerous figure was preparing to rise. Someone who would promise to restore order, crush enemies, and make Germany strong again. The stage was set. The government was failing. And the people were ready to listen to new voices, no matter how dangerous they were. When people lose hope, they don't always choose the best leader. They choose the loudest one. Germany in the early 1930s was like a ship caught in a storm. The captain had lost control, the crew was confused, and the passengers were terrified. Economic pain was everywhere. Political fights had turned into street battles. Trust in the government had collapsed. And in this moment of fear and frustration, new voices began to rise. These were not soft voices calling for calm. These were loud, confident, and emotional. They didn't speak the language of compromise. They spoke the language of anger, national pride, and simple solutions. Among these voices, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party stood out the most. But they weren't the only ones. Across Germany, radical groups on both the left and the right were gaining followers. The communists promised to destroy capitalism and create a workers' state like the Soviet Union. The Nazis, on the other hand, promised to restore Germany's greatness, crush its enemies, and undo the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. For ordinary Germans who had lost jobs, homes, and hope, these promises sounded powerful. Mainstream politicians were offering slow plans, complicated laws, and boring speeches. The extremists were offering emotion, certainty, and blame. Hitler was a master of using this emotional wave. His speeches were theatrical, dramatic, and filled with passion. He didn't just talk, he performed. Standing in front of thousands, he would start quietly, almost calmly, describing Germany's suffering. Then he would raise his voice, build intensity, and end with explosive shouting, pointing fingers at enemies, promising revenge, and painting a glorious future. His message was simple. The politicians have failed you. The Treaty of Versailles has humiliated us. The Jews, communists, and foreign powers have ruined Germany. I will fix it all. I will make Germany strong again. For a struggling population, this wasn't just a speech. It was a lifeline. People were tired of confusion. Hitler gave them clarity, even if it was built on lies and hatred. The Nazi Party also knew how to use modern tools to spread their message. They organized massive rallies with flags, music, and military-style marches. These weren't boring political meetings. They felt like national celebrations. The sense of unity and power was intoxicating. Their propaganda machine worked day and night. Posters, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and slogans flooded the streets. Everywhere Germans looked, they saw the same message. Germany can rise again. Meanwhile, communist groups were also growing fast. In working-class neighborhoods, they promised a new world, a Germany without rich elites or foreign control. They organized strikes, protests, and sometimes violent clashes with police and rival groups. This battle of ideologies turned Germany into a pressure cooker. Every election became more heated. Crowds filled the streets. Political enemies attacked each other, not just with words, but with fists and bullets. Moderate parties, the traditional democratic groups, started shrinking. Their supporters were either losing faith or being pulled toward the extremes. The political center, which had held Germany together after World War I, was falling apart. In the 1930 elections, the Nazi Party went from being a small fringe group to becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. Millions of Germans who had never considered supporting them before now voted for them. And by 1932, they became the largest party in Germany. Why? Because they were saying what desperate people wanted to hear. They promised quick fixes for problems that had existed for years. They blamed outsiders for internal issues. And they offered a strong leader in a time when the government looked weak. It's important to understand, not everyone who supported Hitler was a fanatic. Many were simply desperate. They had lost their savings, their jobs, and their faith in democracy. To them, the Nazi Party looked like the only movement that was going somewhere. Hitler's rise wasn't built overnight. It was built on years of suffering, anger, and unanswered questions. Every time the government failed, his message grew stronger. Every economic crisis was like fuel for his fire. And while the world was watching the Great Depression as an economic tragedy, inside Germany, it was becoming a political revolution. People who had once believed in slow change were now ready to follow anyone who promised quick answers, even if those answers were dangerous. This is the terrifying power of hard times. When people are desperate, they don't always choose wisely. They choose whoever promises to make the pain stop. And Hitler's voice was the loudest of them all. Germany wasn't just struggling with unemployment and poverty anymore. It was struggling with identity, fear, and anger. And in this struggle, a radical movement was becoming unstoppable. Some leaders wait for the right moment. Others create it. Hitler didn't wait. He struck when Germany was at its weakest. By the early 1930s, Germany was standing on shaky ground. The economy had collapsed. Millions were jobless. Political trust had disappeared. And people were tired of speeches that led nowhere. In this moment of deep despair, Adolf Hitler saw his golden opportunity. The Nazi Party had already grown fast during the Depression, turning from a small radical group into a major political force. But Hitler wanted more. He didn't just want followers, he wanted power. Real power. And he knew that Germany's broken system could give it to him. Germany's democracy at that time, the Weimar Republic, was weak. Governments kept changing. No party could win a clear majority. Coalition after coalition fell apart. People had lost faith in their leaders. And into this political chaos, Hitler stepped like a man with all the answers. His strategy had two sides, a legal path and an emotional path. The legal path. Hitler understood that if he tried to take power by force, the army and the world would crush him again, like they did after his failed beer hall putsch in 1923. So this time, he chose a smarter way, through elections. The Nazis ran powerful campaigns. Their posters were everywhere. Their rallies were bigger than ever. They promised jobs, national pride, and a future where Germany would rise again. And their message was simple, emotional, and clear. No complex plans, just bold promises. And it worked. In 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. They didn't win a majority, but they had become too big to ignore. Behind the scenes, powerful businessmen and conservative politicians started to think that maybe they could use Hitler. They believed they could make him chancellor, control him from the background, and use his popularity to stabilize the country. It was a huge miscalculation. The emotional path. While he played the political game, Hitler was also winning hearts. His speeches weren't just political, they were emotional events. He spoke about the humiliation of Versailles, the betrayal by weak politicians, and the suffering of ordinary Germans. He painted himself as the only man who understood the pain of the people, the one leader who had the courage to stand up and take action. His message connected deeply with a population that felt ignored and abandoned. And in January 1933, the moment finally came. After months of political deal-making and backroom talks, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many politicians thought this was a clever move. They believed they could control him once he was in office. But they were wrong. The moment Hitler stepped into power, everything changed. He moved fast, like a man who had been preparing for years. Within weeks, the Reichstag building was set on fire. The Nazis blamed the communists and used the event as an excuse to suspend civil liberties, arrest political opponents, and silence the press. Then came the Enabling Act, a law that gave Hitler the power to rule without parliament. It passed after intense pressure and fear. And with that one law, Germany's democracy was effectively dead. The Nazis banned all other political parties, took control of the police, the media, and the education system. Trade unions were crushed. Judges who didn't support the regime were replaced. Bit by bit, Hitler turned a democratic state into a dictatorship. And the people? Many cheered. After years of chaos and crisis, Hitler gave them something they hadn't felt in a long time: direction. Jobs programs began. Public works like highways, autobahns were built. Military expansion started quietly. Propaganda showed a new Germany rising from the ashes. But behind this new energy was a darker truth. Hitler wasn't fixing Germany for peace. He was preparing it for revenge. The Great Depression had broken people's trust in democracy. And Hitler used that broken trust like a tool, slowly, cleverly, ruthlessly, to grab absolute power. What's shocking is how legal much of it looked. There were no tanks in the streets at first, no grand coup. Just laws, speeches, and propaganda, all happening in plain sight. By 1934, when President Hindenburg died, Hitler merged the role of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, the supreme leader of Germany. The man who once stood on the edges of politics, mocked as a fringe extremist, had now become the undisputed ruler of one of Europe's most powerful nations. And it all started because he understood one thing better than anyone else: crisis creates openings. While others hesitated, Hitler grabbed his chance. Germany thought it was choosing stability, but it had opened the door to dictatorship. Sometimes, the loudest mistake is silence. As Hitler rose to power in Germany, the rest of the world watched, quietly. The Great Depression had shaken every country. Economies were weak. Governments were struggling at home. Nobody wanted another war. So, when Hitler began to push the limits, many nations simply looked the other way. In the early 1930s, Europe still carried the painful memories of World War I. Millions had died. Entire cities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Politicians and citizens across Britain, France, and other nations had one main wish: never again. So, when Germany started rearming, even though it was strictly forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, the reaction from the world was not outrage, it was hesitation. Leaders in Britain and France thought, Germany is just trying to fix its economy. They won't dare start another war. We have our own problems to solve first. This attitude was called appeasement, a policy of not confronting Hitler, hoping that by giving him small allowances, he would stay peaceful. Britain, still dealing with unemployment and economic issues, didn't want to spend billions building a new military. France was politically divided and exhausted from the previous war. The United States, meanwhile, had turned inward. After the Depression hit, America focused entirely on fixing its own economy. It adopted a policy called isolationism, staying away from Europe's political mess. This silence and inaction gave Hitler exactly what he needed: time. While the world looked away, Germany secretly rebuilt its army, trained new soldiers, expanded its air force, and began producing weapons at a massive scale. Step by step, they were breaking every rule of the Versailles Treaty. In 1936, Hitler made his first bold move. He sent German troops into the Rhineland, a zone that was supposed to remain demilitarized. According to the treaty, this was a direct violation. France had every right to stop him. Germany's army was still weak at that point. Even a small French response could have forced Hitler to retreat. But nothing happened. France did not act. Britain didn't intervene. The League of Nations, the international organization created to keep peace, issued statements, but no real action followed. Hitler himself admitted later that if the French had marched in, the German army would have backed down. But when he saw that nobody responded, his confidence exploded. The silence of the world told him something powerful. I can break the rules and get away with it. After Rhineland, Hitler became even bolder. He pulled Germany out of international agreements. He increased military spending. He started making alliances with Italy and Japan. And the world, still mostly silent. Part of the reason was fear. Britain and France were still traumatized by the previous war. Their leaders believed that if they pushed Germany too hard, it might lead to another deadly conflict, something their people did not want. Another reason was underestimation. Many foreign leaders didn't truly believe Hitler meant what he said. They thought his speeches were for show, that he was using strong words to keep his people united, not to actually start a war. And finally, there was self-interest. Each country was struggling with the Depression. Leaders cared more about fixing their own economies than standing up to Germany. This combination, fear, underestimation, and self-interest, created the perfect environment for Hitler's plans to grow unchecked. While other nations stayed silent, Hitler was rewriting the map of Europe in his head. He saw silence not as peace, but as weakness. Step by step, he tested the boundaries. Step by step, the world failed to respond. And step by step, the danger grew louder. The silence of the 1930s wasn't peaceful. It was dangerous. It gave a dictator time to prepare for something far worse. History often remembers wars for their battles. But sometimes, the most important part of the story happens before the first shot is fired. In the meetings, in the decisions not made, and in the silence that allows evil to grow. The world's quiet reaction to Hitler's rise wasn't just a background detail. It was a key chapter in how the Second World War became possible. By the time the world finally spoke up, it was too late. It started with falling stocks and empty wallets, but it ended with tanks, bombs, and a world on fire. The Great Depression began as a financial disaster. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, and millions of people were thrown into poverty. But by the end of the 1930s, this economic crisis had turned into something much darker. It had fed hatred, strengthened dangerous leaders, and pushed the world toward another global war. At first, the chain reaction was slow, like a match burning quietly. But once it reached the right point, the flame exploded. The Depression destroyed people's faith in democratic governments. In Germany, the Weimar Republic looked helpless. People lost their jobs, their homes, and their trust. Into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, promising quick fixes and national glory. And they weren't the only ones. Across Europe, economic hardship made people turn toward strongmen, leaders who promised action, not talk. Democracy felt weak. Extremism felt powerful. The Depression didn't just make people poor, it made them angry, scared, and easily influenced. It created a mood where radical ideas started sounding reasonable. Hitler understood this mood perfectly. He used the Depression as his greatest political weapon. In speech after speech, he blamed outsiders, the Treaty of Versailles, Jews, communists, foreign powers, for Germany's suffering. He gave people someone to hate. Hatred became a tool to unite the nation, not through love, but through a shared enemy. And it worked. People were desperate for answers, and Hitler gave them simple ones, even if they were built on lies. This rising hatred didn't stay inside Germany. It influenced other countries too. Fascist movements grew in Italy and Spain. Authoritarian ideas spread across Europe. The economic crisis wasn't just destroying banks, it was reshaping politics. While hatred was spreading, the rest of the world stayed mostly silent. Britain and France tried to avoid conflict. The United States focused on its own recovery. Nobody wanted to confront Hitler early on. This silence gave dictators the breathing room they needed. Germany rearmed, rebuilt its strength, and prepared for a future that others hoped would never come. But hope is not a strategy. Once Hitler had power, his ambitions exploded. He no longer wanted to just fix Germany's economy. He wanted to redraw the map of Europe. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland. In 1938, he annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and nobody stopped him. Later that year, he demanded Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Britain and France agreed, hoping to avoid war. Just months later, he took over the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Each bold move was like a test. And every time, the world failed to respond strongly. Meanwhile, Germany's economy had shifted toward war production. The Depression had forced the nation to rebuild, but Hitler rebuilt it for war, not peace. New factories made tanks, planes, and weapons. Unemployment dropped because millions were now working for the war machine. Germany had turned economic crisis into military power. By 1939, Hitler's goals were clear. He signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, removing his biggest threat in the East. And then, on September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. This was the final spark. Britain and France declared war on Germany. And just like that, the world that had been broken by economic depression was now engulfed in World War II. What began as a financial crisis had turned into the deadliest conflict in human history. The Great Depression wasn't just about falling stock markets. It was about how economic pain changes societies. It breaks trust. It fuels anger. It gives rise to leaders who promise fast answers. And when those leaders turn their ambition outward, the world burns. This is why historians often say the road to World War II began not with a bullet, but with a crash. The crash of 1929 didn't just change economies, it changed the destiny of nations. It gave birth to movements that thrived on fear. It silenced those who should have acted. And it turned desperation into destruction. By the time the world woke up, it wasn't just facing an economic depression, it was facing a war that would reshape history forever. The Great Depression didn't fire a single bullet. It didn't invade countries or drop bombs, but it quietly opened the doors for those who would. It showed how fear can reshape nations, how poverty can silence reason, and how desperation can turn dangerous promises into believable solutions. From Wall Street to Berlin, from breadlines to battlefields, this crisis turned the world upside down. Democracies weakened, dictators rose, and step by step, the road to war was built. Not with tanks at first, but with empty wallets, broken trust, and silent desperation. For millions, the depression was personal. It was the father who lost his job and couldn't feed his children, the farmer who watched his land dry up, the banker who saw years of savings vanish in a single night, the young generation who grew up not with dreams, but with hunger and fear. These personal tragedies came together to shape political movements, reshape nations, and eventually ignite global conflict. History often focuses on battles, invasions, and military strategies. But the Great Depression is a reminder that wars don't always start with weapons. Sometimes, they start with economic cracks that slowly grow until the entire system breaks. The Depression fed anger, nationalism, and hatred. It gave rise to voices that promised to rebuild, but also to conquer. And in the silence of the world, those voices found room to grow. The story of the Great Depression is a story of warning. When economies collapse, societies change, and when hope fades, chaos grows. That chaos can build movements, shape nations, and, as history proved, feed the beast that would bring the world to the edge once again.